We're actually going to start the message with a little clip here, so I'm just going to have to bring the sound up a little bit. This is my week's message, is changing directions. It's part of actually a message I shared last week at a youth retreat, so I wasn't even here last Sunday, so I wanted to share that a little bit. So go ahead and hit that for us.
That's not my father. It's just my reflection.
No. You see, he lives in you.
Anybody recognize that movie?
Iron King.
Okay. How many of you have seen the movie? Okay. Now, this was the first movie that we took our oldest son, Joshua, to. He's going to be 21 next month. Yes. And he was almost 3, so do the math. Yeah, this came out in the summer of '94. How many of you remember going to this as kids? Maybe, yes. You know, I still remember, I was sharing, I shared this last week. I've been actually using this summer a lot too with going to being at Camp Indian Trails with kids. It's great because you say, remember when Simba comes out at the beginning and they're singing, Mountain Vineyard. I want to blow out the speakers trying to sing loud. I can't sing very well. Anyway, so I remember that. They're holding him up in the air. Yeah, okay. And then later on, there's a part where, there's a cub. They're singing that just can't wait to be king. I just feel like I'm a little loud here. Anyways, and then he goes off after his father's death, and he meets Pumbaa and Timon. You guys remember Pumbaa? Call me Mr. Pig. And they sing, Hakuna Matata, what a wonderful phrase. Well, y'all know this one, right? Hakuna Matata, ain't no passing craze. I see some in the back. Anyways, it means no worries. We could go on. So, and then as he's there, finally he comes to this place as he's growing up that, you come to the scene where he's beginning to realize that he's not the place he's supposed to be. I mean, for a while that was where he should be, but he comes to this time where, and he's wrestling with this, and when he goes to the water, he looks in there and he sees reflection. What does he say he sees? Yeah, he just says, I just see myself. And then he said, then Rafiki, the baboon, says, look harder. Right, thank you. I've been working on that. And what does he see? He sees his father. And Rafiki says, he lives in you. Right? And then as dad appears in the clouds, we saw, and he says, remember who you are. I think one of the things, we're so busy so many times that, our lives are filled with things going on that we forget who we are. And the fact is that we are people made in God's image, that we belong to God, that we are loved. And as we talk about in Addison's baptism, we are loved by God. We're children of God, chosen and deeply loved. But we're so busy, we miss it. We miss out. And God, it says in the scriptures, doesn't live like somewhere out in heaven, even though we often talk about God that way. It's that God actually dwells in us. Paul talks about this, he's quoting the Athenian philosophers who say, in God we live and we move and we have our being. It's like God is closer than the air we breathe. How many of you have seen the movie The Matrix? The Matrix, right? There's a scene where they're actually living in this computer program, and Morpheus says to Neo, he says, do you think that's air you're breathing? Right? The reality is it's not the air we breathe that gives us life. It's God's presence that sustains us. But we're so busy often that we can't even see it. Last week when I was talking, the talk I was asked to give was on metanoia. And I was like, what is metanoia? Right? And it's this Greek word that's used when Jesus comes and he says, God's kingdom has come near. He says, repent and believe the good news. And I always hate that word repent. Who kind of feels uncomfortable when you hear that, like you've been naughty, right? You better stop it. And that's not what the word means. People have used it, but they didn't use it the way it was supposed to be used. The word actually means just to turn and go a different way, right? It's kind of like Simba saying, remember who you are. Remember, who you really are. So I want to invite us just for a second to do that. And to do that, I want to invite you, wherever you're sitting, just to kind of get comfortable. Maybe put your hands on your knees. Sit up a little bit so you're not going to fall asleep while we're doing this. And I want to invite you to close your eyes for just a moment. There's a story in the Bible of a guy named Elijah who goes to see God. He goes out in the wilderness. He's on this mountain. And there's this huge storm. But God's not in the storm. And there's this fire, but God's not in the fire. And there's this earthquake, but God isn't in the fire. And then it says there was a sound of sheer silence. Like this is where Simon and Garfunkel got their song, The Sound of Silence. And when the sound of sheer silence came, he knew that God was there. So I want to invite you just for a moment to be able to open yourself, to just be still and know that God is God. Psalm 46 says, be still and know that I'm God. Be still and know that I am. Be still and know. Be still. Be. I invite you to go ahead and open your eyes. Could take longer than it might be to fall asleep either, because it gets really comfortable. What was that like? Anybody want to share? If you feel comfortable, don't feel like you have to. Anybody? Relaxing? Yeah. Did this last night at the scout camp. There's a parent saying, I haven't felt that peaceful in like the whole week. I've just been busy. We often talk about how do we talk about God? Rob Ellis' video talks about all the reasons you can believe God exists, but the reality is that it's not about proving or disproving God. If you want to open yourself to see if God is there, we just need to be still sometimes, just to open ourselves. And if God is there, to let God be the one to speak to us. So I'll invite you, maybe during this week or even the weeks to come, that maybe just to take a moment sometime, just to be still and open yourself to the fact that God might just be there waiting for you to listen to that sound of silence. I was talking about this remembering who you are and this turning and going a new way. And I shared last week kind of my experience of that. When I was in high school, I read this book called The Late Great Planet Earth. Maybe you ever heard of The Late Great Planet Earth? Okay. I forgot the guy's name. It's been a while. Hal Lindsey. Hal Lindsey was a big name back in the 70s and 80s, And The Late Great Planet Earth he was trying to analyze all these biblical prophecies, and he said that the Soviet Union was going to bring in the end times. Anybody here remember the Soviet Union? A few folks, right? All right, so obviously he was wrong. It's not around anymore. But I remember reading this book, and the thing that hit me about it as I was reading over my Christmas break in my senior year was the sense that that life is short. My dad had died when I was in 8th grade, and if life is short, what is life about? Where is God in the midst of this? And I had this realization that, God for me had been a very important part of my life, that God had just been part of my life. And I remember wrestling with this sense that God wanted all that I was. And it was the hardest thing, and I have a hard time putting it into words, but the closest thing I can come to is something shared by a guy named Blaise Pascal. I don't know if you've ever heard of Blaise Pascal. I think he invented trigonometry or something, so you know who to blame, right? He wrote of this experience he had of God, which we all call the numinous experience, when the Spirit of God comes. He says, from 10:30 to 12:30, fire. He says, joy, 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 indescribable joys. They have not known thee, but I have known thee. I remember just sitting there. I was laughing and crying at the same time. I just wanted to stay there. And finally, with great boldness, I went and knocked on my mom's door and said, "Mom, would you mind if I went to ministry and set up aerospace engineering?" And she said, "Whatever you want." And we went and talked to my pastor, who'd been praying for that. Nasty people praying for you like that. Right? And so I remember going off to Carthage College. I was a religion major. And I met some folks who, from a different tradition. I had grown up in the Lutheran tradition, which, where we've been connected. And this was a very different tradition than I had been part of. And they were talking about what Jesus did for us. And they would say to us, using kind of images of water, he said, it's like the story of Peter walking on the water to Jesus. And he begins to sink. He said, the point is, you got to keep your eyes on Jesus. So in Jesus, it's like God throws us this life preserver, only we've got to grab it. So it's like this gift you have, but you've got to open it. So you've got to accept Jesus if you want to be saved. We'll talk about this. And I hadn't heard this before, so I try to do this, and I go to all these meetings, and they'd ask you, do you want to accept Jesus? And I'd raise my hand every time, because what if it hadn't taken the time before, I told you, if you didn't do this, you weren't going to make it, right? So I go to all these meetings, and they would do that, I raise my hand, and finally at this one meeting, the guy asked us to raise our hands and want to accept Jesus, and I did it because, again, what if it hadn't taken the time before? And then a whole bunch of other folks did it, and then he asked us, and this just kind of opened my eyes, he said, how many of you have done this before? And every one of us raised our hands. And I realized that, we were all afraid, like, we had to do something right or we weren't going to be in with God. And one day I remember I had to, as part of my seminary training, I was working in this hospital, kind of as a chaplain, and I had to preach on the story of Peter walking on the water. And if you read the story, Peter is in the boat, Jesus comes walking on the water, and he says, Lord, if it's you, let me come out. And Jesus says, come on, and he gets out of the boat, and as he's walking, he sees the wind and the waves, and he gets afraid, he starts to sink. And so I'm looking for what my friends had said he was going to do, like, that he looks up and gains his faith, or, maybe he pulls himself up by the bootstraps. But I read the story, none of those things happen. If you read the story, what happens is, it says, when Peter's there without faith, he's completely, lost, and it says that Jesus reaches down and pulls him from the water. And I had this realization that it wasn't about me accepting Jesus, it's that he'd accepted me. It wasn't, that God gives me this gift, I have to open it. The gift's mine no matter what I do with it. In fact, it's not the God that we meet in Jesus is not a God who stands on the side and throws your life preserver hoping you grab onto it. But the God we meet in Jesus is a God who dives into the water and pulls us from the water even when we can't do anything. Part of the reason that we baptize babies and not just adults, because some churches only baptize adults because you have to be old enough to understand, they think, to accept this. We baptize babies as well as adults because Addison's not going to remember this day. But even though she doesn't remember it, we do and God does. It says that even before she knows it, before she can do anything, that this came as a gift. That we, all of us, belong to God's family, regardless of what we did or said or prayed. It's that God accepts us. I think of the story of this old guy in the street corner listening to a street preacher. Anybody ever seen the street preacher? Ever seen him? Sometimes he can have the megaphone and stuff. I remember seeing one. They're kind of scary folks. They're like they want to let you know what you need to do. And there's a street preacher who's preaching, and all these folks are gathered around. This old guy sitting there on the street corner. And the street preacher finishes preaching, and all the folks do one of these, because they know he's looking for someone to kind of, to call on. So the old guy's sitting there, and he sees the old man, and he says, "Old man," he says, "are you saved?" The old man scratches his head for a moment, and thinks, and he says, "Well," he says, I think I'm saved. So the street preacher decides he's going to pin him down and says, "Can you tell me exactly when you were saved?" The old man scratches his head, thinks a moment again, anyway. He says, "I can't tell you exactly. It was about 2,000 years ago. And I just found out about it recently, though." I really think that especially for me coming from the Lutheran background, a Christian who just happens to be Lutheran, that I think this speaks deeply of what God is like, that even before we knew it, 2,000 years ago, God did everything that was needed. Even if we haven't found out about it, even if we just found out about it recently, it's still ours. It was all taken care of. And we're free.